October 17th, 1929. 6:23 in the morning, Staten Island, New York. By that hour, the decision had already been made. The work was finished. The city had moved on. What lay in the drainage ditch off Highland Boulevard was no longer supposed to be a man. It was meant to be residue, evidence of order being restored, a correction quietly applied to a problem that had grown inconvenient. The people responsible believed in numbers. They believed in procedure. They believed that if you applied enough damage, reality would cooperate. 50 stab wounds is not an argument. It is a conclusion. A throat cut from ear to ear is not a warning. It is punctuation. They had done everything right. They had taken their time. They had chosen isolation over spectacle, distance over chaos. No witnesses, no noise that would matter. The kind of violence designed not to make a point, but to erase one. By the time the car pulled away in the early hours of the morning, there was nothing left to debate. The body in the ditch had stopped responding. Blood loss had done its work. Shock had done the rest. If anyone had been keeping score, the ledger would have shown the same result it always did. Problem solved. This is the part of the story where most histories would end if they mentioned it at all. A failed gangster. Another name removed from circulation. Another ambition corrected by force. But history does not turn on what should happen. It turns on errors. Police officer James McGuire was not looking for anything that morning. Staten Island patrols in 1929 were about routine, not revelation. You drove the route. You noted what didn't belong. You kept moving. At first, he did exactly that. The shape in the ditch registered as debris. Rags, maybe. Something dragged and discarded. Staten Island collected those kinds of things overnight. Then, the smell reached him. Blood has a way of announcing itself, not loudly, persistently. It lingers, heavy and unmistakable, cutting through morning air that hasn't yet decided what kind of day it will be. McGuire stopped the car. Up close, the damage was excessive in a way that only professionals ever bother with. Faces don't end up like that by accident. Throats don't open themselves. Knife work that deliberate is not emotional. It is instructional. This was a message meant for people who would never see it. He knelt. He checked for identification out of habit, not hope. That was when the mistake revealed itself. The chest moved, not much. Not enough to inspire relief, just enough to disrupt certainty. One shallow breath, then another. The smallest rebellion against a verdict that had already been agreed upon. Whoever this man was, he was not cooperating with the narrative. The ambulance took 17 minutes to arrive. In those 17 minutes, nothing improved, nothing stabilized. There was no heroic rally, just a body continuing to exist in defiance of arithmetic. The medics didn't bother hiding their disbelief. They had seen what knives do. They had seen what blood loss does. This was not survivable. It was not even arguable. But the body didn't care what was arguable. At the hospital, they counted the wounds properly. 50. Not slashes, not hesitation marks. Intentional placements meant to empty a body without wasting time. The throat wound alone should have ended it, hours earlier. Somewhere between the first cut and the last, it hadn't. The man's name, when they finally found it, did not belong in a ditch. Not if you understood how the city actually worked. Not if you understood who benefited from order and who paid for it. Salvatore Lucania, a name spoken quietly in rooms where men pretended not to notice who was listening. A name associated not with loyalty, but with ideas, and ideas were harder to kill than people. At that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that an execution had failed, and in worlds built on reputation and consequence, failure is not neutral. Creates imbalance. It invites recalculation. Somewhere in New York, men were waking up believing the night before had gone exactly as planned. They would drink coffee, read the papers, continue with business they assumed no longer faced resistance. They did not yet understand what they had created. Because when you try to erase someone and fail, you do not return to the status quo. You escalate the story. You turn a man into a variable you can no longer predict. Survival changes the math. This is not a story about luck, no matter what the headlines would later decide to call it. This is a story about what happens when violence, applied correctly by the standards of its time, collides with a man who understands that staying alive is not the same thing as winning. If you want the version of this history that stays polite, that explains itself, that stops where it's supposed to, this is not it. This is the account that begins where the job was meant to end, because from that ditch, forward. Nothing in New York's underworld moved the same way again. And the men who ordered the killing would eventually learn the most expensive lesson crime ever teaches. You can miss with a bullet, you can miss with a knife, but you never miss with the consequences. Stay with this story, not for what it promises, but for what it refuses to hide. Long before there was a body in a Staten Island ditch, there was a problem no blade could fix. New York's underworld in the 1920s ran on inheritance, not money, memory. Old grudges carried across the Atlantic, old rules written in dialects the city itself no longer spoke. Power was not something you earned by performance. It was something you claimed by bloodline, age, and proximity to Sicily. The structure was simple, brutally simple. One boss, absolute authority. Everyone else fell in line or disappeared. It had worked, after a fashion, for men who thought small, for men who believed territory was more important than systems, and fear more reliable than foresight. But New York was no longer a village. It was a machine, and machines punish outdated logic. Salvatore Lucania understood this before most men understood what he was becoming. He had arrived in America as a child, not a conqueror. He grew up watching the streets of the Lower East Side rearrange themselves every few years. New immigrants, new hustles, new languages. He learned early that loyalty shifted faster than tradition and that survival depended on reading change, not resisting it. By the time he reached his early 30s, Lucania had already absorbed the city's most important lesson. Crime was no longer about domination. It was about coordination. That idea alone made him dangerous. The men who ran things then, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, were products of an older math. They believed power flowed downward from a single source. They believed fear could substitute for structure. They believed that lineage mattered more than adaptability. Lucania believed none of that. To him, crime was logistics, supply chains, distribution, arbitration, a business ecosystem that functioned better when friction was minimized and profit shared rationally. He did not see rivals as enemies by default. He saw inefficiencies. That was the heresy. He built alliances across lines that had once been fatal to cross: Jewish financiers, Irish muscle, Italians who cared more about margins than myth, men like Meyer Lansky, who treated numbers with the same seriousness others reserved for omens, men who understood that violence was a tool, not a philosophy. Together, they imagined something that sounded almost obscene to the old guard. Governance. A commission. A table where disputes could be settled without bloodletting, where power could be balanced rather than hoarded. Democracy, stripped of romance and reduced to function. To Masseria and Maranzano, this wasn't innovation. It was insubordination. Worse, it was contagion. Ideas spread faster than bullets, and this one threatened to make their entire worldview obsolete. Maranzano, in particular, took it personally. He saw himself as a builder of empires, a man restoring Roman order to American chaos. He studied hierarchy the way others studied scripture. To him, Lucania wasn't just disrespectful, He was sacrilegious, a younger man, Americanized, surrounded by non-Sicilians, speaking openly about shared power. That combination was intolerable. By 1929, the Castellammarese War had already poisoned the city. Alliances shifted weekly. Assassinations blurred together. No one trusted longevity. Every meeting carried the quiet assumption that someone wouldn't leave it alive. In that environment, Lucania's vision wasn't merely threatening. It was destabilizing. If men began to believe there was an alternative to endless retaliation, then the authority of those who thrived on chaos would collapse. Both Masseria and Maranzano reached the same conclusion independently, which should have been a warning sign neither of them heeded. Lucania had to be removed, not punished, not sidelined, erased. What makes this moment remarkable is not the decision itself. Crime is full of those, but the timing. Neither boss coordinated with the other. Each believed they were acting decisively alone, restoring order in their own image. In reality, they were racing. Two aging systems competing to eliminate the same future. The knife was not the beginning of the conflict. It was the admission that the old rules could no longer contain what Lucania represented. Violence was the only language left to men who had run out of arguments. And when men choose violence as punctuation, they are announcing that the sentence has already gotten away from them. By the night of October 16, 1929, all of this was already in motion. Deals had been made, cars assigned, instructions given with the calm certainty of men who believed history was still on their side. Lucania walked into that night unaware of which faction would reach him first, but fully aware that the city was no longer big enough for all the ideas fighting to control it. What followed would not decide who ruled New York immediately. It would decide whether the future belonged to tradition or to the man who survived long enough to redesign it. October 16, 1929. Late evening. Lower East Side, Manhattan. Salvatore Lucania did not leave the meeting thinking it would be his last walk. There was no sense of ceremony to it, no instinctive warning. The city did not change its posture. The streets sounded the same. Traffic moved. Voices overlapped. New York had never paused for premonition. He stepped outside carrying nothing unusual. No entourage, no visible armor. Confidence had become its own disguise by then. Men who expected death tended to draw it faster. The car was already waiting. A Packard. Clean. Expensive. Out of place only if you were looking for the wrong details. Lucania recognized the driver immediately. Not a stranger. Not a nervous face. Someone connected to Maranzano's operation, familiar enough to suggest legitimacy, familiar enough to lower defenses. That was the first layer of the trap. The message was simple. There was a meeting. There was business to discuss. Lucania understood meetings. He also understood when they were unnecessary. Maranzano did not summon people casually. He scheduled power. And this had not been scheduled. Still, he did not run. Men who built reputations on fear learned early that fleeing confirmed guilt faster than silence ever could. If they wanted him dead in the street, it would already be happening. The presence of a car suggested intention beyond spectacle. He got in. The door closed with a finality that would not reveal itself until much later. The car moved north, then east, away from familiar routes, away from expectation. Conversation never started, which told him more than threats ever could. When violence is loud, it's often improvisation. Silence means rehearsal. Lucania did the math quickly and without panic. 4 men, armed, confined space, a moving vehicle. Any attempt at resistance would be theater, not strategy. Jumping from the car would not save him. Fighting inside it would not end it. The only leverage left was patience, waiting long enough to see where they intended to finish the story. That patience would cost him everything. The city gave way to bridges. Manhattan receded. Brooklyn passed without acknowledgement. When Staten Island came into view, the purpose clarified. Isolation, water, darkness, places where screams did not travel far enough to matter. The car turned off Highland Boulevard and rolled onto a dirt road that did not appear on maps tourists carried. This was not where negotiations happened. The engine cut. The night filled the silence. They ordered him out. Cold air came off the water. It carried no urgency, no emotion, just exposure. The kind of night that made people feel small if they allowed it to. They formed a loose circle around him. No rush, no words wasted. One of them stepped forward, the enforcer who would later be remembered only as the man who made sure. Luciano saw the first punch coming only after it had already connected. What followed was not chaos. It was a procedure. They worked him over systematically. Fists first, then boots, then metal. Bones broke without ceremony. Teeth left his mouth without negotiation. Every strike was measured. Every pause is intentional. This was not interrogation. The questions were formalities, asked without expectation of answers. They were not there to learn. They were there to demonstrate consequence. Luciano did not speak. Silence was not bravery. It was policy. Words could not improve his position, and pain was already guaranteed. Information was currency, and this was not a market he intended to participate in. Minutes stretched. His face stopped resembling anything identifiable. Pain flattened into sensation without edges. Somewhere along the way, his body began to shut down systems it no longer believed it could afford. When he stopped responding, they adjusted. The knife came out, 8 inches of metal, chosen for reliability rather than drama. They did not stab wildly. They placed each wound where it would do the most work. Chest, abdomen, back, legs, a map of efficiency drawn directly onto flesh. Each insertion was an investment in certainty. By the time they reached the count they'd been instructed to reach, the outcome felt academic. The throat was last, not out of necessity, but ritual. The final proof. The punctuation mark that ended discussion. They dragged what remained of him to the ditch without urgency. No one checked for breath. No one felt the need to linger. Experience told them this was finished. They left him where runoff collected, and morning would not arrive with witnesses. The car drove away, believing the city had just been stabilized. They would not realize for hours that they had only removed the illusion of control. Time passed the way it always does after violence, indifferently. The road went quiet. The water kept moving. Staten Island did what it had done long before men started using it as a place to finish things. If anyone had been watching the ditch, they would not have seen a struggle. There was no crawling, no cinematic refusal, just a body that failed to complete the task it had been assigned. Death is not a switch, it is a process, and processes can be interrupted. For hours, Salvatore Luciano existed in a state the doctors would later describe with words that avoided responsibility. Shock, trauma, blood loss, terms that explained nothing and excused everything. By every rule that governed bodies, he should have crossed the line sometime before dawn. He didn't. What kept him there was not consciousness. It was not resolve in the heroic sense. It was something smaller and more stubborn. A refusal embedded so deeply it no longer required thought. Systems failing one by one, but not an agreement. The ditch filled slowly with what had been inside him. The cold slowed the bleeding just enough to matter. Muscles tightened, blood thickened. Coincidences stacked in ways no one would have bothered planning for. Luck, later, would be the word used by people who needed the story to make sense. But luck implies randomness. This was alignment. When Officer McGuire found him, it wasn't the sight that unsettled him most. It was the contradiction, damage that severe belonged to a finished narrative. Bodies that looked like that did not negotiate with mourning. Yet There it was, the faint, irregular insistence of breath. The ambulance ride did not restore dignity. It preserved function. Medics did not speak in encouragement, they spoke in probabilities, and none of them were generous. This was not a rescue. It was containment, a question mark being moved indoors. The hospital, the count began. 50 wounds. Each one catalogued like a mistake someone else would have to explain. Surgeons worked without optimism. Optimism implied expectation. They had none. Their job was not to save him. It was to see how far they could get before reality corrected itself. It didn't. 6 hours of work, blood borrowed from strangers, bones set into shapes they no longer remembered, a throat repaired just well enough to make sound possible later, though never comfortable. When it was over, no one declared victory. They stepped back from the table and waited for the body to disagree. It didn't. 2 days later, Luciano opened his eyes. There was a detective in the room. There always is. The law arrives after violence the way auditors arrive after collapse, late, curious, and ultimately irrelevant. The questions came carefully. Who did this? How it happened? Whether there were names to attach to the damage. The detective knew the answers were unlikely. The ritual mattered more than the outcome. Luciano gave him nothing. Not defiance, not cooperation, absence. He did not deny. He did not accuse. He declined to participate. Memory loss was the story offered, and it was offered without negotiation. The detective recognized the boundary immediately. Street logic still outranked procedure in 1929, and everyone in the room understood it. The file would remain open. The case would remain unresolved. The silence would remain intact. After the detective left, Luciano lay still and took inventory, not of pain, but of consequence. Pain was temporary. What mattered was the error that had occurred upstream. Someone had ordered his death and failed to confirm it. That failure changed everything. Because an attempt is not neutral, it cannot be undone. It announces intent without delivering resolution. And intent, once revealed, forces response. Luciano did not think in terms of revenge. Revenge was emotional. It was inefficient. What he understood was exposure. Whoever had authorized the hit had shown their hand, and in doing so, admitted uncertainty. Certainty does not try twice. The newspapers would catch up soon. They would simplify the story into something readable. A nickname, a miracle, a survivor framed as spectacle. They would call him lucky because it fit on a headline and spared them the responsibility of explaining the alternative. Luciano accepted the name without comment. Names are tools, so are myths. What mattered was that he was no longer merely a participant in the war tearing the city apart. He had become proof that the old rules no longer guaranteed outcomes, proof that violence alone could misfire. Proof that systems built on fear collapsed when fear stopped working. He stayed quiet after that, not out of caution, but calibration. Recovery took time, so did observation. Enemies exposed themselves when they believed a threat had been neutralized. They would not realize their mistake until it was too late to correct it. Because the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the strike. It is the realization that the strike failed. Silence can look like weakness to men who don't understand timing. After the hospital, after the papers finished their brief fascination with survival, after the city absorbed the story and filed it away as an anomaly, Salvatore Luciano did something that unsettled everyone who was watching closely. He disappeared without vanishing. No speeches, no retaliation, no sudden show of force meant to reassure allies or intimidate enemies. He recovered. That alone confused the old guard. In their world, survival demanded immediate response. A failure to strike back was interpreted as fear, and fear, once detected, was harvested. Luciano let them believe it. Behind closed doors, the reckoning was already underway. But it did not begin with bullets. It began with arithmetic. Who stood to gain from his death? Who had the authority to order it? Who moved too confidently? Afterward, the attempted execution had narrowed the field dramatically. Two bosses, two systems, both outdated in different ways, both convinced they were indispensable. Neither understood that indispensability is a myth men tell themselves right before they're replaced. Lucania's injury forced him to slow down physically, which suited him strategically. When movement is limited, observation sharpens. He watched how alliances shifted in his absence, who spoke too openly, who assumed the future had already been decided. He took notes without writing anything down. The Castellammarese War dragged on, chewing through manpower and credibility. What had once been about dominance now looked like waste. Profits stalled, territories fractured. The old system, built for loyalty, proved incapable of managing ambition at scale. Lucania did not intervene to stop the bleeding. He let it clarify. By 1931, the city was tired. Tired of funerals, tired of uncertainty, tired of bosses who ruled by inheritance but couldn't guarantee stability. Men who had once benefited from tradition began quietly asking a different question, not who was in charge, but what worked. Lucania had an answer ready. The first move was Masseria. Joe, the boss, had survived by brute force and paranoia for years. He trusted no one fully and paid for loyalty in fear rather than profit. Lucania understood that men like that didn't fall to open rebellion. They fell to convenience, a lunch invitation, a familiar setting, no visible threat. When Masseria was removed, it wasn't framed as a coup. It was framed as an inevitability. 4 men walked in and ended a reign that had already hollowed itself out. Lucania was not present when it happened. That detail mattered. Absence suggested detachment. Detachment suggested order. Maranzano believed this left him alone at the top. He declared himself boss of all bosses, formalizing a title that sounded impressive but functioned poorly. Absolute authority works only when no one is capable of challenging it. New York, by then, was full of men who could. Maranzano made the mistake of believing the knife had settled things. He did not realize the reckoning had been delayed, not canceled. Lucania understood something Maranzano never did. Power that must announce itself is already insecure. Instead of challenging the title, he challenged the structure beneath it. He watched Maranzano attempt to impose old rules on a new environment. He watched resentment grow among lieutenants forced into submission they no longer respected. He watched tradition choke on scale. When the response came, it was surgical. Men dressed as police entered Maranzano's office, authority impersonating authority. The symbolism was not accidental. By the time the deception revealed itself, the outcome was already locked in. Maranzano died the way he had lived, believing hierarchy would protect him. With both old bosses gone, there was a moment of vacuum. Historically, that moment would have birthed another tyrant, another singular authority repeating the same mistakes with different decorations. Lucania refused that path. Instead of taking the title everyone expected him to claim, he dismantled the concept entirely. The commission was not a power grab. It was a redesign. 5 families, equal votes, disputes resolved by negotiation before they metastasized into war. Violence became enforcement, not governance. This was not mercy, it was efficiency. The city stabilized not because men became better, but because incentives finally aligned. Profit flowed predictably. Bloodshed decreased not out of morality, but out of cost control. Lucania never called himself boss of all bosses. He did not need to. The system bore his fingerprints without carrying his name. The reckoning was complete not when his enemies died, but when the rules that empowered them stopped existing. And all of it traced back to a ditch on Staten Island where a body failed to cooperate with expectations. History prefers clean lines, clear villains, clear victories. It is uncomfortable with men who survive long enough to complicate the record. Salvatore Lucania became inconvenient the moment he refused to die. The newspapers solved that problem by renaming him. Lucky was easier to print, easier to repeat, easier to dismiss. It framed survival as chance rather than consequence, randomness rather than resistance, a nickname that reduced an error in planning to a cosmic shrug. Lucania accepted it without protest. He understood something journalists never did. Names are containers. You let the public fill them with whatever makes them comfortable while you do the work elsewhere. Lucky Luciano became the story. Salvatore Lucania remained the operator. The rest of his life unfolded without urgency. Prison, exile, distance from the city he had reorganized so thoroughly that it continued functioning without him. The system outlived the man, which is the only reliable measure of success in that world. When he died in Italy decades later, there were no final revelations, no confessions, no myth-breaking honesty. He left behind exactly what he intended to, a structure that did not depend on his presence to survive. That was the real victory. The night in 1929 was not important because of how close he came to death. Plenty of men came close. What mattered was how completely the attempt misunderstood him. The men who ordered the hit believed power resided in endings, that if you removed a threat, the problem resolved itself. They believed violence concluded stories. Lucania understood that violence only edits them. By surviving, he forced the narrative to continue in a direction no one else had prepared for. The old order collapsed, not because it was challenged openly, but because it failed privately. Its methods no longer produced reliable outcomes. A system that cannot guarantee results cannot command loyalty. That was the lesson, buried beneath the blood and the headlines. Not that he was lucky, not that he was tough, but that he was adaptable in a world that punished rigidity. The ditch on Staten Island was supposed to be a full stop. Instead, it became a comma. From that moment forward, organized crime in America stopped looking backward. It stopped pretending tradition was strategy. It learned to think in terms of sustainability rather than dominance. Lucania did not destroy the old ways out of spite. He replaced them because they no longer worked. That is how real power changes hands, not in explosions, not in declarations, but in quiet redesigns that make resistance impractical. The story survives because the error survives. A man left for dead who refused to complete the assignment. A system confident in its methods that discovered too late they were outdated. A nickname that concealed a warning. Some people cannot be killed because killing them is the wrong solution. They don't survive by luck. They survive because they understand that endurance is leverage. And once you understand that, you stop trying to win quickly. You win permanently.